My brother was a golden child until his dark secret was exposed. My brother Samuel has always been the golden child in our family, while I was often overlooked. Growing up, he was never held accountable for his actions, no matter how harmful they were. When I met Victoria, my girlfriend, I was determined to protect her from Samuel's manipulative tendencies. Unfortunately, when I finally introduced her to my family at a dinner party, things took a dark turn. From the moment Victoria walked in, Samuel acted inappropriately. He was overly physical with her, making her visibly uncomfortable. He monopolized her attention, constantly finding excuses to touch her and inserting himself between us. During dinner, he even attempted to feed her from his own fork while maintaining unsettling eye contact. Throughout the evening, he humiliated me with exaggerated and fabricated stories, painting me as a weak and unstable person. My parents not only tolerated this behavior, but encouraged it by nodding along to his false narratives. After dinner, Victoria was cornered in the kitchen by Samuel. He had blocked her exit, stood too close, and made suggestive remarks about how she deserved someone more exciting than me. She had already told him to back off twice by the time I found them. When she saw me, she immediately moved to my side, visibly shaken. Samuel, of course, laughed it off as a joke. The real nightmare began shortly after that evening. Victoria started receiving strange calls and texts from unknown numbers. At first, it was just heavy breathing or hang-ups, but then the messages escalated, insulting her, calling her names, and even referencing specific details about her day, proving she was being watched. Samuel's old high school friends began loitering around her workplace, the pediatric ward of a hospital. One even followed her to her car late at night, leaving her terrified. She began having panic attacks before her shifts, dreading what would happen next. Armed with screenshots, recordings, and security footage, we went to police. At first, they seemed concerned, but as soon as we mentioned Samuel's best friend Tyler, who happened to be the son of a local police sergeant, their attitude changed. Suddenly, they were downplaying the situation, suggesting that Victoria had misinterpreted innocent interactions. Frustrated, we asked to speak to another officer, but we were stonewalled. The most they agreed to do was issue vague warnings. Meanwhile, my parents continued to defend Samuel. When I confronted him with evidence, he smirked and dismissed it. I lost my temper and punched him, which led my parents to accuse me of being unstable. They refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing on Samuel's part, and instead doubled down on their belief that Victoria was the problem. Then came my mother's so-called family intervention. She convinced us to come over, claiming Samuel wanted to apologize. When we arrived, we were ambushed. The house was full of people, including Samuel's friends, some of whom had been stalking Victoria. For 2 hours, they attacked her character, painting her as manipulative and mentally unstable. My mother even claimed Victoria was jealous of Samuel. My aunt suggested she was imagining the harassment due to stress from her job. Samuel played the victim perfectly, acting devastated that she would accuse him of such things. The final straw was when they invited Tyler and his friends to join us for dessert, supposedly to prove they were nice young men. Victoria had a panic attack and had to leave the room. When I tried to follow her, my mother grabbed my arm and told me to choose between my real family and a girl causing drama. Without hesitation, I chose Victoria. The harassment escalated further. Samuel's friends spread false rumors at Victoria's workplace, causing her supervisor to call her in for a meeting. While he was sympathetic, he warned that the disruption was affecting her job and subtly suggested she transfer elsewhere. Feeling trapped, Victoria started looking at job opportunities in a different city. We also hired a lawyer to pursue restraining orders, but progress has been slow. Then came my cousin Holly's wedding. Holly is the only family member who truly sees Samuel for who he is. She promised extra security and took precautions, but it wasn't enough. Samuel couldn't resist causing trouble, and by the end of the night, he was in handcuffs. I wish I could say this was over, but I know Samuel and I know my parents. They won't stop. For now, my priority is keeping Victoria safe and finding a way to move forward, even if it means leaving behind a family I once hoped would change. The moment I noticed Samuel was no longer at his table, An uneasy feeling crept over me. Something felt off. As I made my way toward the bathrooms, a piercing scream from Victoria shattered the air. Instinct took over, and I ran. Just as I turned the corner, I saw Miller, her husband, and his brother rush ahead. What they found confirmed my worst fears. Samuel had Victoria pinned against a hallway wall outside the bathrooms, trying to force himself on her while she fought back. His hand clamped over her mouth, his grip on her arm so tight it was already leaving bruises. Miller and his brother wasted no time. They yanked Samuel away just as I arrived. Victoria was trembling, tears streaming down her face, her dress torn at the shoulder. The bruises on her arms were already forming. Samuel, clearly drunk, started shouting nonsense, claiming Victoria had been teasing him all night, that she had followed him when in reality, she had been there first. Miller's brother, a cop from another city, immediately called the local police while Miller took Victoria to a private room where Holly and her mother tried to console her. And then, as if things weren't already horrific, they got worse. When the police arrived, my parents tried to stop them from arresting Samuel. My mother screamed it was all a misunderstanding, blaming Victoria for leading him on, insisting they couldn't let a little drunken mistake ruin his life. My father went as far as physically blocking the officers from handcuffing him, saying it should be handled as a family matter. Samuel alternated between sobbing about how Victoria had seduced him and making threats, looked completely unhinged. As they finally forced him into the squad car, he shouted vile slurs at Victoria, claiming she had been asking for it since they first met. Several guests had recorded the entire meltdown on their phones. The aftermath was brutal. My parents went on a rampage, calling every relative they could, twisting the story. According to them, Victoria had lured Samuel to a secluded area, came onto him, and then cried assault when he rejected her. They claimed she orchestrated all for revenge over lies he had supposedly exposed. They even accused Miller and his brother of attacking Samuel before the police arrived, which they hadn't, and suggested Victoria inflicted the bruises on herself. But they underestimated the evidence against them. Holly's wedding videographer had captured Samuel following Victoria to the bathrooms. Multiple witnesses had seen his behavior throughout the night, his crude comments, how he'd been following her around. With the bruises, witness statements, and video footage, our lawyer assured us we had a solid case. That didn't stop my parents from pressuring me. They threatened to disown me if Victoria didn't drop the charges, bombarded me with calls and texts, alternating between guilt-tripping me about destroying the family and warning that they would ruin my future. They even showed up at my apartment, causing such a scene that the neighbors called the police. My mother wailed about her baby going to jail, while my father threatened to ensure I never worked in this state again. But Victoria and I had already made our decision. She accepted a job offer at a hospital 300 miles away, and I arranged to work remotely. At the end of the month, we were gone. Some might say we were running, but in reality, we were choosing peace, choosing to escape the toxicity. Holly understood and promised to keep us updated on any family developments. The hardest part in all of this? Knowing that my family would never admit Samuel needed help. Even after watching him assault someone in broad daylight at a wedding, they still defended him. I sometimes wonder if things would have been different if someone had stepped in when we were kids. But we'll never know. Right now, all I can do is focus on protecting Victoria and building a new life far away from the family that enabled a monster. For years past, for years of silence. Then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up with calls from my mother. I ignored them at first. My family had a habit of using new numbers to reach me. But then she left a voicemail, her voice frantic and desperate. When I finally called back, she was sobbing so hard I could barely make out her words. Samuel had gotten married last year to a woman named Rachel, someone none of us had even heard of. They had met at church, and the families arranged the marriage quickly. My mother gushed about how perfect everything had been, how Samuel had finally found a good Christian woman who understood him. Until last week, Rachel had missed 3 days of work. A co-worker, concerned, called the police. When officers conducted a welfare check, they found her in horrific condition. 2 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and bruises covering her body. But that wasn't even the worst part. During their investigation, Police uncovered that my father had been actively helping Samuel cover up the abuse for months. Every time Rachel threatened to leave or tell someone, my father stepped in, using his connections to pressure her family about their mortgage, even threatening to have her fired from her job at a company owned by a friend. He had convinced her parents she was mentally unstable, using the same gaslighting tactics they had used against Victoria. The final straw? Rachel had gotten promotion at work, something that would have given her financial independence. Samuel lost it, beating her so badly she couldn't even leave the house. When she called my father for help, his response: "Put some ice on it, and remember your wedding vows." Thankfully, her co-worker didn't listen. They called the police. Now, Samuel and my father were both in jail. Samuel for domestic violence, my father for witness intimidation and conspiracy. My mother pleaded with me to come back, to stand by the family in this time of crisis. She still refused to acknowledge the truth, claiming Rachel must have exaggerated, just like Victoria supposedly had. I lost it. I reminded her of every time they had covered for Samuel, of how they defended him when he assaulted Victoria. I asked her if she ever considered that if they had held him accountable earlier, maybe Rachel wouldn't be in the hospital now. She broke down, finally admitting they had always known Samuel had issues but thought they were protecting him by covering them up. Too little, too late. I hung up and blocked her number. 6 months later, things continued unfolding. Samuel took a plea deal, 8 years in prison with parole eligibility after 5. My father's case was still ongoing, his real estate license suspended, and his business crumbling. Meanwhile, my mother, to my utter surprise, started therapy. She moved out and filed for divorce. A month ago, she sent me a 12-page letter apologizing for everything: her enabling, failing to protect me, and most of all, her treatment of Victoria. I haven't responded. Victoria and I welcomed our daughter, Emma, 3 months ago. She is healthy and beautiful. Every time I look at her, I think about how my parents would have expected me to let Samuel near her if I had stayed in contact. That thought alone confirms that cutting them off was the right choice. The cycle of abuse and enabling ends with me. Emma will grow up surrounded by real love, by people who respect boundaries. No more toxicity. No more second chances for monsters. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for your child is to walk away from a family